A crown does not glitter when it is born. It steams. It comes up slick from the ground, heavy with soil, smelling of iron and rot. It has fingerprints pressed into it by men who will never wear it, nails broken by panic, breath cut short by mud. Power enters the world like a parasite, not a blessing. It does not choose the worthy. It waits for the exhausted. It appears only after the room has emptied, after the rules have collapsed, after the blood has soaked deep enough that no one remembers what the floor looked like before. The paradox is simple and cruel. The more sacred the crown claims to be, the less holy its origin must remain. History does not reward those who believe in destiny. It rewards those willing to step over bodies without looking down. This is not a story about who deserved to rule. It is a record of who was still standing when everyone else had finished killing each other. The field was quiet because there was nothing left to argue about. England had spent 30 years grinding its own nobility into fertilizer, a civil war marketed later as romance and lived then as slaughter. Cousins murdered cousins, banners changed hands mid-battle, and loyalty became a short-term lease. By the end, the great houses had achieved something remarkable. They had won nothing and destroyed everything. The old medieval fantasy of divine bloodlines lay face down in the mud, its armor cracked, its prayers unanswered. Kings were no longer chosen by God. They were chosen by momentum. Richard lay where the momentum stopped, the last Plantagenet, the final inheritor of a myth that said ancestry was protection. His crown did not sit on his head anymore. It had fallen into the hedgerow, tangled in thorns, a decorative object briefly liberated from meaning. That detail matters. The crown was not seized in triumph. It was found. Salvage, not inheritance. A relic recovered from the wreckage by men who understood that symbols only matter if someone survives to point at them. And then there was Henry, not charging, not glorious, emerging. A man stepping forward only after the noise had ended. If Europe had been taking bets on the future of England 20 years earlier, his name would not have appeared on the board. He was genealogical trivia, a footnote with ambition, a claim so thin it bordered on optimism. He did not come from the main branch of the royal tree. He came from a graft, half legitimized, half tolerated, sustained mostly by the hope that everyone else would die first, which inconveniently for England, they did. Henry had not been raised to rule. He had been raised to hide. Exile teaches different lessons than courtly education. It teaches you that food is not guaranteed, that alliances expire, that smiling too openly invites knives. While princes were learning how to joust for applause, Henry was learning how to wait without rusting. While heirs practiced being seen, he practiced being missed. 14 years as a political ghost sharpened him into something far more useful than a knight. He became cautious. He became boring. He became patient. Patience is not passive. It is aggressive restraint. Henry watched England from across the water as its aristocracy performed a public suicide. He saw men rush toward power as if speed itself were legitimacy. He learned the inverse rule. The last man alive wins, regardless of how he looks crossing the finish line. When the music stops, it is not the best dancer who matters. It is the one still in the room. When the crown was placed on his head, it was not placed by angels or bishops. It was pressed down by a man who had waited to see which side survived. The symbolism was perfect because it was honest. No choir, no oil, just an object recovered from dirt and given to someone ruthless enough to keep it. The Middle Ages ended not with a trumpet, but with a practical decision. Henry understood immediately that he had not inherited a kingdom. He had inherited a crime scene. England was bankrupt. The nobility was traumatized and dangerous. The people were exhausted and suspicious. And he himself was a stranger, a Welshman, a foreign accent, a king who sounded wrong. The crown fit poorly not because it was heavy, but because it was unconvincing. Weak claims create strong paranoia. Henry never forgot how close he had come to being nothing. He did not see the throne as a reward. He saw it as a debt that could be called in at any moment. Every smile in court looked like a test. Every noble lineage looked like a potential lawsuit. The medieval fantasy said kings ruled by divine right. Henry believed in something simpler. Kings ruled until they were replaced. That belief shaped everything. The first Tudor instinct was not conquest. It was consolidation. Not expansion, but sealing the leaks. Henry did not trust bloodlines because his own was fragile. He did not trust loyalty because he had watched it switch sides mid-afternoon. He trusted paper. He trusted contracts. He trusted accounting. This was not the behavior of a romantic hero. It was the behavior of a man who knew that if legitimacy is questionable, control must be airtight. The crown from the bush was not a symbol of destiny. It was a warning. It said this could be taken. It said this had already fallen once. It said anyone could reach into the hedgerow and pull it out if the conditions were right. Henry built his reign around preventing those conditions from ever forming again. But history enjoys symmetry. A dynasty born from collapse rarely escapes it. The same paranoia that keeps a crown secure also poisons it. The same vigilance that prevents rebellion strangles trust. Henry's England would become stable, but never relaxed. Safe, but never warm. The soil that had produced the Tudors would never be clean again. It would remain productive, efficient, and permanently stained, because power taken from mud never forgets the feel of mud. It does not float above the ground. It presses down on it, hard, afraid that if it loosens its grip for even a moment, someone else will bend down and take it back. Henry did not rule like a man chosen by heaven. He ruled like a man chosen by accident, who intended to make sure the accident never repeated itself. Survival had taught him the only rule that mattered. Power is not seized once, it is renewed daily, like a lease with unforgiving terms. Miss a payment, and the property changes hands. He had spent half his life without a country. That absence rewired him. Kings raised in palaces imagine the throne as furniture. Henry saw it as a ledge, something you cling to with your fingers while gravity negotiates. He had watched princes grow careless because their names were long and their ancestors impressive. He had watched those same princes die screaming. Blood, he learned, is not insurance. It is a liability that attracts challengers. So he began by lowering the temperature. The court he inherited was still drunk on violence. Men arrived armed not just with swords, but with grudges, old loyalties, and private armies disguised as household staff. They expected another warlord, another charismatic butcher who would let them settle scores under royal banners. Henry disappointed them immediately. He did not roar, he did not rush. He counted, he asked questions, he demanded paperwork. It was deeply unsettling. He had no interest in being loved. Love had proven unreliable. He wanted to be unavoidable. The problem with winning a crown through collapse is that collapse leaves debris. England was littered with noble families who believed they were one good rumor away from reclaiming the future. Henry treated them not as enemies, but as accounts waiting to be audited. He did not purge indiscriminately. That would have created martyrs. Instead, he watched. He listened. He learned who owed whom, who had borrowed to fund armies, who had promised land they no longer owned. Debt, unlike loyalty, does not forget. This was the beginning of a quiet revolution. Medieval kings ruled by spectacle and punishment. Henry ruled by paperwork and anxiety. He discovered that a nobleman who is financially exposed is politically obedient. A man who fears bankruptcy fears the king more than God. So Henry turned the monarchy into something England had never seen before, a balance sheet with teeth. The old aristocracy measured power in horses and men. Henry measured it in bonds and recognizances. These were not laws in the romantic sense. They were traps dressed as favors. A lord would be accused of some technical violation. Too many retainers, an old statute dusted off like a weapon. The fine would be impossibly large. Henry would then smile and offer mercy. No need to pay now, just sign here. Loyalty guaranteed by debt. Freedom replaced by installments. By the end of his reign, most of the English peerage existed in a state of suspended ruin. They were rich on paper and terrified in practice. They could breathe only as long as Henry allowed it. The king had discovered something profoundly modern. Control does not require constant violence. It requires permanent leverage. And Henry was meticulous with his leverage. He remembered exile too well to delegate carelessly. Trust was rationed. Even allies were watched, especially allies. He surrounded himself with men who were useful and unpopular, men whose power came entirely from him. Tax collectors, lawyers, clerks, figures despised by the nobility and therefore loyal to the crown. If hatred was aimed at them, it was not aimed at him. This was not charisma. This was insulation. The most dangerous word in Henry's vocabulary was generosity. Every gift implied obligation. Every favor created a record. He hoarded information the way medieval kings hoarded relics. Who married whom? Who owed money abroad? Who had written suspicious letters during the war? Nothing expired. Everything could be reused. The paranoia that critics later mocked was not madness, it was memory. Henry had seen what happened when kings assumed stability. He had seen how quickly banners flipped when momentum shifted. He did not intend to be momentum. He intended to be gravity. Yet even accountants require legitimacy. Numbers can control behavior, but they cannot sanctify rule. Henry's claim was still thin, still whispered about in foreign courts. He needed reinforcement, not through conquest, but through biology. Blood may not protect, but it persuades. So he reached for the oldest political technology available: marriage. This was not romance. It was surgery. He did not choose a bride. He selected a graft. Elizabeth of York carried the blood he lacked and the ghosts he needed to neutralize. She was the last unburned bridge between two exhausted factions. Their union did not end hatred. It buried it under ceremony. Red and white stitched together, not healed, but presented as whole. Henry delayed the wedding deliberately. He wanted the record to show conquest first, legitimacy second. Pride and paranoia made a neat partnership. He needed it written down that the crown was his before the vows were spoken. A king by force, not by wife. This detail mattered because Henry understood how narratives rot. If history decided he ruled only through marriage, the marriage could be challenged. If history decided he ruled through victory, the wife became reinforcement rather than foundation. When the marriage finally occurred, it was staged as reconciliation. But reconciliation was not the goal. Containment was. The Tudors did not fuse England's wounds. They cauterized them. The symbol chosen afterwards said everything. A rose that could not exist in nature. Two emblems forced into one design and repeated until fatigue turned fiction into fact. The Tudor rose was not truth. It was branding. And branding works best when no one remembers what came before. With an air produced quickly enough to quiet gossip, Henry allowed himself one luxury: sleep. Not peace, just sleep. The machinery was running. The books were balancing. The nobles were afraid. The ghosts of rival claimants still whispered, but now they whispered into walls thick with surveillance. Pretenders would come. Henry expected them. A missing prince is a business opportunity for desperate men, but each challenger only justified further tightening. Each rumor proved the necessity of control. When a child was crowned in Ireland, with a stolen crown taken from a statue, Henry did not rage. He smiled. Rage feeds legends. Ridicule kills them. He turned a boy king into a kitchen servant and taught the realm a lesson. Revolt could be humiliating. Humiliation was cheaper than execution and far more educational. Henry survived because he never believed his own story. He did not mistake endurance for approval. He did not confuse silence with loyalty. He ruled as if the war had never really ended, only changed form. And he was correct. The battlefield had moved indoors, to chambers, to ledgers, to quiet rooms where signatures replaced swords. This was the true foundation of the Tudor state. Not glory, not destiny, administration. Fear made boring. Boring made stable. But survival has a cost. A kingdom taught to fear its king does not love him. It waits for him to die. And Henry, who had outlived everyone who underestimated him, knew this better than anyone. He had survived the chaos. He had stabilized the wreckage. He had built a crown strong enough to hand to a son. What he could not control was what that son would do with a system designed for restraint once it was inherited by someone raised to believe restraint was unnecessary. Marriage in this dynasty was never an act of faith. It was an incision, clean when possible, brutal when necessary, and always performed with the understanding that the patient might not survive. Love was irrelevant. Consent was decorative. What mattered was whether the operation stopped the bleeding. Henry understood that conquest had given him possession, not acceptance. England was quiet, but it was not convinced. Beneath the polished calm of his court, old loyalties still twitched like severed nerves. Yorkists did not disappear because a crown changed heads. They waited. They married carefully. They whispered genealogies like spells. Henry's rule sat on top of this tension, like a lid pressed down on boiling water. The marriage to Elizabeth of York was meant to release pressure without lifting the lid. She was everything his reign lacked: legitimate, familiar, comforting to a population exhausted by uncertainty. Where Henry arrived as an anomaly, Elizabeth was continuity embodied. Her blood carried the memory of kings who had ruled without explanation. By marrying her, Henry did not just neutralize a rival claim, he absorbed it. He turned an enemy inheritance into internal infrastructure. But even surgery leaves scars. Henry did not trust the optics of the union, and distrust defined his choreography. He delayed the wedding not out of indecision, but out of calculation. Timing mattered. Sequence mattered. He needed the record to show that England belonged to him before it belonged to them. Parliament was forced to acknowledge his kingship first, not as a husband, but as a conqueror. Only then could the marriage occur. This ensured that Elizabeth's blood reinforced his crown rather than authored it. It was an act of narrative control masquerading as romance. The ceremony itself was designed to overwhelm doubt. Incense, velvet, gold. A sensory assault meant to quiet the lingering question of legitimacy through sheer excess. Two young people stood at the altar, but the audience was watching symbols collide: red and white, past and present. A war paused long enough to pretend it had ended, and for a moment the illusion worked. The birth of a son arrived quickly, efficiently, like a receipt printed to confirm a transaction. Arthur, a name chosen not for realism, but for myth. The Tudors did not merely want heirs, they wanted anchors, names that reached backward far enough to distract from how recently everything had gone wrong. Myth is useful that way. It allows the present to pretend it has always been inevitable. But even successful surgery introduces new risks. Elizabeth's role was ceremonial, but her existence was essential. She was the human proof that the Tudors were not a hostile occupation. She smiled. She bore children. She absorbed public affection that Henry did not seek and could not safely accept. He needed her visible and contained, revered but not powerful, a symbol, not a partner. The union stabilized the realm, but it did not soften the king. Henry never forgot that marriages could produce rivals as easily as heirs. Blood mixed unpredictably. Children carried claims in their veins without permission. So even as the dynasty appeared to settle, its internal architecture grew more rigid. Surveillance intensified. Bonds multiplied. Mercy remained conditional. Marriage had sealed the wound, but the infection was managed daily. When Elizabeth died young, the loss was not just personal, it was structural. She had been the living hinge between factions. Without her, the Tudor claim reverted to its original fragility, propped up now by sons whose existence raised new anxieties. Children grow, sons inherit, sons question, and sons, unlike wives, eventually rule. Henry aged into a man who measured time not in years, but in contingencies. Every wedding he arranged, every engagement proposed, was evaluated not for happiness, but for risk. Foreign alliances were tempting, but dangerous. A queen from abroad came with relatives, expectations, leverage. Domestic matches carried their own hazards. Elevating one noble family inevitably offended others. Marriage solved problems temporarily. It never erased them. This logic shaped the dynasty's future catastrophes long before they unfolded. The children born from this surgical union grew up in a household where affection was scarce and usefulness was paramount. Sons were investments. Daughters were insurance policies. Emotional attachment was a vulnerability Henry could not afford. He had survived by distrusting sentiment. He raised his children accordingly. Arthur, the heir produced on schedule, embodied the dynasty's hope for normality. A healthy boy meant stability. A conventional succession promised rest. But history rarely honors neat plans. Arthur died young, quietly, almost apologetically, leaving behind a void that reopened every fear the marriage had been meant to suppress. The wound had not healed. It had only been closed. With Arthur gone, the marriage's logic inverted. Elizabeth's bloodline, once a stabilizing force, became a reservoir of anxiety. Who now inherited her legitimacy? Her surviving children. And with them came new calculations. Daughters who could be married into power. Sons who might fail to live. Biology reasserted itself as the most unreliable ally in politics. Henry's reaction to this uncertainty was not adaptation, it was escalation. Marriage, once a surgical tool, became a compulsion. The dynasty would cut again. And again. And again. Each operation promised finality. Each delivered only temporary relief. The belief took hold that the correct union, the correct wife, the correct womb, could finally force history into compliance. This belief would destroy everything Henry had built. But that was still ahead. For now, the Tudor household presented an image of success: a crowned king, a legitimate queen, a male heir. England breathed more easily. Foreign courts adjusted their calculations. The crown from the bush had been polished, stabilized, placed on a head that now seemed permanent. Yet beneath the pageantry, the same truth lingered. This dynasty had been assembled, not anointed. Its stability depended on continuous maintenance. Marriage had been used to halt chaos, not to invite peace. And structures built to stop bleeding rarely become places of comfort. The Tudors would learn that bodies subjected to repeated surgery do not become stronger. They become scarred, sensitive, and prone to catastrophic failure. And the scalpel was still in their hands. Power does not fear enemies it can see. It fears vacancies. Empty spaces invite stories, and stories invite men willing to die for them. Henry understood this instinctively. He had lived as a rumor long enough to know how dangerous rumors could become once they found a face. The kingdom he ruled was haunted, not by the dead, but by the missing. Two boys had vanished years earlier in a tower that was supposed to protect them. Their bodies were never displayed. Their graves were never blessed. And in politics, an unburied body never stops moving. Absence becomes evidence. Silence becomes possibility. As long as the princes were not conclusively dead, they were everywhere, in taverns, in foreign courts, in letters written with plausible handwriting, in the mouths of men who needed a king more than they needed the truth. Henry did not believe in ghosts, but he believed in what ghosts did to the living. Every pretender who appeared afterward followed the same script: a face vaguely familiar, a story rehearsed just enough, a sponsor with money and resentment. These men were not threats because they were convincing. They were threats because they were useful. They gave discontent a costume. They gave nostalgia a spine. And they gave foreign powers a low-cost way to destabilize England without declaring war. Henry's response was instructive. He did not treat pretenders as rivals. He treated them as symptoms. Each one revealed a fault line that required reinforcement. The solution was never catharsis. It was containment. When a boy was crowned king in Dublin using a stolen religious ornament, Henry did not rush to martyr him. He crushed the rebellion efficiently, then did something far more devastating. He spared the child. Mercy, when applied correctly, is not kindness. It is humiliation weaponized. The would-be king was sent to work in the royal kitchens, turning spits, sweating near fires, watched by men who had once bowed. The lesson was clear. Rebellion would not be honored with tragedy. It would be reduced to farce. England laughed, and laughter disinfects faster than fear. But comedy does not end insecurity. It sharpens it. The second pretender arrived better prepared, older, more polished, backed by a woman who understood hatred as a lifelong project. He toured Europe like a celebrity claimant, welcomed into courts eager to irritate England. He spoke convincingly. He looked right. He was dangerous, not because he was real, but because enough people wanted him to be. Henry fought him without armies. He fought him with economics, trade embargoes, financial pressure, quiet deals that made supporting a ghost expensive. He starved the lie until it collapsed under its own maintenance costs. When the pretender finally landed with a peasant army and realized no one was coming to save him, the performance ended. Captured, confessed, reduced. Execution came only after persistence. Henry tolerated illusions until they became contagious. Then he eliminated them decisively and publicly. The rope, not the axe. No dignity, no romance. A common death for a common lie. With each pretender neutralized, Henry tightened the net. Surveillance expanded. Informants multiplied. Letters were intercepted. Foreign ambassadors were watched more closely than criminals. England began to resemble something new. Not a medieval kingdom, but an early warning system. A place where rumors died quickly because someone was always listening. Fear became infrastructure. The nobility noticed the shift immediately. Rebellion no longer looked like a gamble worth taking. It looked like paperwork leading to ruin. Bonds ensured obedience. Spies ensured silence. The crown no longer needed to intimidate openly. It simply needed to remember everything. Henry's paranoia was not a flaw. It was an organizing principle. He ruled as if every smile concealed a ledger entry. Every conversation might be recalled later, differently, with consequences attached. This atmosphere changed behavior. Men became cautious. Language softened. Ambition learned to whisper. The cost was intimacy. Trust evaporated. The court became a place where alliances were temporary and friendships conditional. Henry preferred it that way. Familiarity breeds entitlement. Distance breeds compliance. But paranoia is never satisfied. It feeds on its own success. Each threat avoided confirms the necessity of vigilance. Each quiet year justifies deeper monitoring. The system Henry built required constant reinforcement because it had taught everyone to fear unpredictability. And fear demands reassurance, which only more control could provide. The ghosts did not disappear. They changed form. As the king aged, anxiety shifted from external challengers to internal succession. Sons died, daughters survived. The line of inheritance grew complicated again. Each child represented both continuity and vulnerability. A future king could not be protected forever. A future queen could be married into danger. The Tudor bloodline, once reinforced through marriage, now generated new uncertainties. Henry responded the only way he knew how, by doubling down. Control intensified. Dissent narrowed. Law became elastic. Loyalty was defined negatively. You were faithful until proven otherwise. Silence was compliance. Questions were suspicious. The kingdom was stable. It was also brittle. Henry did not live to see the full consequences of this system, but he designed them carefully. He left behind a crown heavy with procedures, expectations, and unresolved fears. A machine that ran smoothly as long as the operator understood its fragility. The problem was that his successor would not inherit Henry's memories, only his tools. The ghosts Henry had fought were manageable because he understood how easily he himself could have been one. He knew the hunger of obscurity. He respected the power of myth. His children would not share this perspective. They would grow up believing the throne was furniture, not salvage, and ghosts are patient. They wait for certainty. They wait for arrogance. They wait for a ruler who believes the crown can no longer fall into the bushes. Henry ensured that no one would take it easily again. But in doing so, he taught England a habit that would outlive him, the habit of fear. A state that listens constantly eventually hears enemies even when none exist. And when power begins to argue with itself, collapse becomes only a matter of timing. The pretenders were gone. The paranoia remained. And it would soon turn inward, where ghosts do the most damage. The system Henry built was flawless for one specific type of man: suspicious, joyless, scarred by loss. It functioned because its creator never forgot how close he had come to erasure. Unfortunately, systems do not get to choose their heirs. When Henry died, England did not inherit another survivor. It inherited a spectacle. The boy who took the crown had been raised inside the vault his father built. He had never been hunted, never hidden, never watched cousins murder each other over banners. He knew fear as a concept, not a reflex. To him, the throne was not a ledge. It was a stage, and stages demand applause. Henry VIII entered power like sunlight after a long winter. Tall, athletic, loud with confidence, he looked like a correction. Where his father had been narrow and calculating, the son was expansive, radiant, almost offensively alive. The court exhaled. The nobility smiled again. England mistook relief for renewal. This was the Golden Prince problem. Absolute security produces men who believe consequences are optional. Henry VIII had been educated like a spare and crowned like a miracle. Raised by scholars, priests, and women, he had been trained to impress, not to endure. Languages, music, theology, athletics. He was not a king forged by necessity. He was a prince designed to be admired. And admiration is addictive. The first thing he dismantled was his father's insulation. The hated administrators were arrested. The mechanisms of fear were blamed on dead men who could no longer object. The court cheered as if cruelty had been abolished rather than reassigned. Henry VIII wanted love, and he wanted it immediately. Coins were thrown, tournaments restored, war promised. The crown stopped whispering and started singing. He confused popularity with legitimacy. The treasury Henry VII had built like a bunker was opened like a wine cellar. Gold flowed. Gifts multiplied. Wars were planned not because they were necessary, but because they were theatrical. Henry VIII did not want stability. He wanted glory. He wanted to be remembered the way his father had feared being forgotten. But the state his father built had a specific weakness. It assumed restraint. It assumed the man at the top understood fragility. Remove that understanding, and the machine does not adapt. It accelerates. Henry VIII spent like a man who believed God had co-signed his overdraft. France became an obsession, not for strategy, but for comparison. He wanted to be seen as the equal of continental monarchs who measured prestige in battles and palaces. England's careful neutrality bored him. Peace looked like cowardice. Administration felt beneath him, so he outsourced responsibility. Enter Thomas Wolsey, the butcher's son with the brain of a calculating engine and the ambition of a man who had never been allowed to forget where he came from. Wolsey understood the arrangement immediately. Henry would perform kingship. Wolsey would manage it. The deal was intoxicating for both men. One received adoration without effort. The other received power without restraint. For a time it worked. England became louder, richer in appearance, more visible. Diplomatic summits turned into festivals of excess. Temporary palaces rose and vanished. Gold fabric replaced stone. Europe watched England burn a year's revenue in weeks and mistook extravagance for strength. But extravagance is not an asset. It is a liability that looks impressive until the bill arrives. Henry VIII's vanity reached its peak when he decided that reality itself should reflect his self-image. He was not content to rule. He needed confirmation, tournaments, portraits, foreign praise. When he lost a wrestling match in public, the humiliation did more damage than a military defeat. Ego cracked. And when ego cracks, paranoia leaks in. The Golden Prince began to tarnish. His body changed. Injuries accumulated. The effortless athleticism that had defined him faded, but the expectation of admiration did not. This mismatch between self-image and reality created a pressure Henry could not tolerate. He needed reassurance not from the court, but from God, and God inconveniently was silent. The state his father had built to control nobles now became a tool to control belief. Henry VIII inherited a machine designed for caution and repurposed it for obsession. The ledgers became instruments of punishment again. The courts became stages for loyalty tests. What had once been defensive became punitive. The problem was not that Henry VIII was cruel. Cruelty had always existed. The problem was that he was insecure without knowing how to manage insecurity. His father had responded to fear with patience. The son responded with action, rapid action, permanent action. The Golden Prince wanted permanence in a world built on contingency. He wanted certainty from biology, validation from religion, and obedience from everyone at once. The system strained under these demands, but it did not break yet. It simply waited for the moment when the king's desires would collide with something immovable. That collision would not come from armies. It would come from a womb, because no amount of applause can substitute for succession, and no system, no matter how well designed, survives a ruler who believes it exists to serve his ego rather than restrain it. The Tudor machine had survived fear. It would now face indulgence. And indulgence is far more destructive because it disguises collapse as confidence. There is no theological debate more dangerous than one conducted by a desperate man with absolute power. When biology refuses to cooperate, belief becomes negotiable. Henry VIII did not wake up one morning planning to tear God out of England. He woke up counting daughters. The first years passed politely. Catherine was loyal, pious, competent, a queen in the traditional sense, but the pregnancies kept ending the same way. Stillbirth, infant death, silence where a future king was supposed to cry. To most men, this would have been tragedy. To Henry, It was accusation. Kings do not fail by chance. They fail because something is wrong with the universe, and universes, inconveniently, cannot be punished. Wives can. Henry began where all tyrants begin, when reality resists them. Scripture. Not to understand it, but to interrogate it. He did not read the Bible for wisdom. He read it like a contract, searching for clauses that might explain why the deal had soured. He found one. A single verse in Leviticus, obscure, conditional, elastic enough to stretch over 18 years of marriage. If a man shall take his brother's wife, they shall be childless. Childless. The word landed like a verdict disguised as prophecy. It did not matter that Catherine swore her first marriage had never been consummated. Oaths are fragile things when they conflict with desire. Henry decided the marriage had always been cursed, that God had tolerated it until impatience finally outweighed mercy. This revelation arrived conveniently, just as his attention fixed itself on a woman who refused to be compliant. Anne Boleyn did not enter the story as a love interest. She entered as a problem. She would not accept the role of disposable pleasure. She would not disappear quietly. She demanded elevation or nothing. This made her irresistible. Henry had spent his life taking. Anne introduced friction, and friction creates obsession. What followed was not romance. It was a siege. Henry wanted a solution that preserved both his ego and his theology. An annulment, not a divorce. A correction, not a confession. He wanted God's permission to rewrite the past. He sent Wolsey to Rome believing bureaucracy could solve metaphysics. It usually could. This time it failed. The Pope stalled. Politics intruded. Empires leaned in. Catherine's relatives happened to be the wrong people to offend. Suddenly, Henry found himself trapped between doctrine and desire, between obedience and appetite, between biology and God. So he chose to redefine God. This was the real revolution, not the legal acts, not the sermons, the mental pivot. Henry stopped seeing the church as an authority and began seeing it as a competitor, a foreign corporation siphoning loyalty and revenue from his territory. Why should a bishop in Italy veto the reproductive strategy of England? The answer was simple: he shouldn't. Henry's advisors found the opening. If the Pope would not bend, the crown would expand. Authority would be relocated. Spiritual jurisdiction nationalized. God would remain. His management would change. The break with Rome was not a theological epiphany. It was a hostile takeover. Once the logic snapped into place, events accelerated. Laws passed. Oaths demanded. Titles reassigned. Henry did not reject religion. He absorbed it. He crowned himself its administrator, supreme head, not a prophet, a proprietor. And like all proprietors, he immediately took inventory. Monasteries were not houses of prayer anymore. They were balance sheets with stone walls, lands, rents, gold, art, silence. Cromwell moved through them like an auditor with soldiers. Shrines were stripped, libraries dismantled. Centuries of devotion were converted into liquidity. England did not become more pious. It became solvent again. God had lost his property rights. But power always demands proof of loyalty. The oath was the line: swear or die. Not because dissent was dangerous, but because ambiguity was. Henry needed the world simplified. One truth, one voice, one authority. Anyone who refused threatened the coherence of the story. Thomas More refused, not loudly, not theatrically. He did not preach rebellion. He did not organize resistance. He simply declined to say what Henry wanted to hear. Silence, once a shield, became a crime. The king did not want obedience alone. He wanted validation. He wanted the smartest man in England to agree with him. When more would not break, Henry broke him. The execution did more than remove a man. It removed a limit. After that, nothing was sacred. Friendship, conscience, sanctity, all negotiable. If God could be revised, so could morality. The king had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He had learned that reality could be forced to comply if enough bodies were used as leverage. Anne Boleyn became queen in the ruins of this transformation. The woman for whom England had been spiritually dismantled. She wore the crown briefly, anxiously, surrounded by enemies created by her success. The son she promised did not arrive. The biology that had started this war refused again. Henry did not reinterpret scripture this time. He rewrote the marriage. Anne's fall was swift, mechanical, and rehearsed. Charges fabricated, trials staged. A head removed with surgical precision. The message was unmistakable. God had not failed. The woman had. Jane Seymour succeeded her and delivered the long-demanded proof. A boy. Edward. England rejoiced. Cannons fired. Bells rang. Henry wept. He had finally beaten biology. Jane died shortly after. The universe had not surrendered. It had simply waited. Henry had broken Rome, shattered marriages, executed friends, and reordered belief itself in pursuit of a male heir. He got one. Fragile, sickly, temporary. The paradox revealed itself too late. Power can bully institutions. It can terrorize people. It can even silence God. It cannot negotiate with bodies. And once a king learns that lesson, he either accepts it or keeps cutting, convinced that the next incision will finally make the world behave. Henry chose to keep cutting. Revolutions are rarely announced honestly. They arrive wearing uniforms borrowed from necessity and leave carrying furniture. What England experienced was not a storming of palaces or a spontaneous awakening of conscience. It was quieter, clerical, conducted with inventories, seals, and deadlines. Faith did not collapse. It was liquidated. Once Henry understood that belief could be administered, the logic became unavoidable. If God's authority could be relocated, then God's assets could be audited. Monasteries, once framed as spiritual fortresses, were suddenly reframed as inefficiencies. Too much land, too little productivity, too many men praying instead of paying. The argument was not heretical, it was managerial. Thomas Cromwell executed this vision with the enthusiasm of a man who knew history would blame the king and forget the accountant. He did not arrive with torches. He arrived with clipboards. Visitors recorded numbers. Valuations followed. Accusations were encouraged. Corruption, real or imagined, was documented carefully. The point was not reform. The point was permission. When the closures began, they were presented as mercy. Smaller houses would be spared. Larger ones would be consolidated. Change framed as care. But consolidation is simply removal with paperwork. Monks were dispersed. Abbots surrendered keys. Reliquaries were cracked open like savings accounts no longer protected by sentiment. Gold flowed back to the crown. So did land. So did silence. The monasteries had been more than prayer factories. They were welfare systems, hospitals, libraries, employers. They fed the poor. They educated the obscure. They anchored communities that had existed longer than most noble families. Their removal did not create heresy. It created vacancies. And vacancies, as Henry had already learned, are dangerous. But vacancies can also be sold. Henry did not hoard the seized wealth the way his father would have. He spent it, quickly, not entirely on war, but on loyalty. Former monastic lands were redistributed to men who could be trusted to defend the new order because they now owned it. This was not generosity. It was inoculation. The nobility was turned into shareholders of sacrilege. Once you profit from destruction, you cannot argue for restoration without implicating yourself. England's elite became complicit overnight. The Reformation did not produce a nation of reformers. It produced a nation of beneficiaries. Men who might have objected to doctrine found themselves unwilling to return estates. Resistance became financially inconvenient. Theology receded. Property rights advanced. The crown's authority expanded accordingly. If it could determine the structure of worship, it could determine anything. The state absorbed the church not to save souls, but to eliminate competition. No rival source of legitimacy, no foreign appeals, no alternative moral hierarchy. One king, one truth, one ledger. The psychological effect was profound. Obedience stopped being about belief and started being about compliance. Oaths were taken not because men agreed, but because refusal was impractical. Religion lost its vertical axis. It became horizontal, enforced by neighbors who feared the consequences of dissent as much as they feared God. This was how violence evolved. Less visible, more efficient. Public executions still occurred, but they were no longer spectacles of chaos. They were demonstrations of process, charges read, verdicts issued. The law performed itself with the calm confidence of inevitability. Resistance was not crushed dramatically. It was processed. Henry believed this was strength. He believed he had finally achieved control without disorder. But control achieved through redistribution creates a new instability. Those who gain power through confiscation know how easily it can be reversed. Loyalty secured by profit is loyal only to continuation. If the system changes, so will the allegiance. Cromwell understood this risk. He tried to institutionalize the revolution before it could revert. New laws, new courts, new precedents, everything written, everything archived. The Tudor state became a memory machine, storing justification in triplicate. The more radical the change, the more documentation it required. And yet the king grew restless. The asset seizure solved immediate problems. It funded wars. It rewarded allies. It weakened the old church beyond repair. But it did not solve the underlying issue. Henry's authority still rested on his body. His ability to rule depended on his health, his mood, his heirs. The system was centralized around a man increasingly aware of his own decay. Power concentrated this tightly always becomes personal. Policy began to track temperament. Favors rose and fell with moods. The new order was efficient, but brittle. It relied on proximity to the king's favor rather than durable consensus. Cromwell's position exemplified this fragility. He had built the machinery. He had enforced the seizures. He had broken institutions older than the monarchy itself. And he had done so as a servant, not a partner. Servants are essential until they become reminders of unpleasant truths. Cromwell knew where the bodies were because he had counted them. When Henry's personal desires shifted again, Cromwell's utility declined. The same administrative ruthlessness that had dismantled the monasteries was suddenly reframed as arrogance. Enemies accumulated quietly. Nobles resented the bureaucrat who had risen above them. Traditionalists loathed the man who had profited from sacrilege. Reformers blamed him for compromises. Cromwell stood at the center of a revolution that now wanted a scapegoat. The end came with paperwork. Accusations assembled. Charges filed. The process reversed itself smoothly. No riots, no outcry. The machine consumed its architect without hesitation. Cromwell was executed not because he had failed, but because he had succeeded too completely. He reminded the court that power now ran through documents rather than blood. That was intolerable. The asset seizure had transformed England materially, but it had also stripped something less tangible: trust. Institutions once respected had been emptied. Sacred spaces commodified. Authority no longer appeared permanent or moral. It appeared effective. Effectiveness inspires obedience. It does not inspire loyalty. By the end of Henry's reign, the religious landscape was exhausted. Neither fully Catholic nor convincingly Protestant, a hybrid constructed through enforcement rather than conviction. People adapted outwardly and retreated inwardly. Belief became private. Survival became public. The revolution had succeeded on paper. England was richer, more centralized, more sovereign. But it had also learned a dangerous lesson: that values are flexible when power insists, that sanctity dissolves under pressure, that the state can redefine meaning if it controls consequences. These lessons would not disappear with Henry. They would be inherited, reinterpreted, weaponized by rulers who had not lived through the chaos that justified them. Children who grew up assuming that confiscation was normal and obedience was rational. The Reformation had begun as a marital crisis. It ended as a structural transformation that no one fully controlled. Assets had been seized. Authority expanded. But the moral ground beneath the crown had thinned, and thin ground does not crack loudly. It gives way suddenly, taking entire generations with it. In this dynasty, queens were not partners. They were variables. Each one entered the system carrying expectations that no woman could survive intact. Fertility without complication. Loyalty without influence. Obedience without silence. When these contradictions failed to resolve, the system did what it always did. It eliminated the variable. Henry's marriages followed a grim internal logic. Each began as a solution and ended as an accusation. The crown did not adapt to wives. Wives were expected to adapt to the crown, and when they could not, their failure was reframed as treason, heresy, or personal defect. Power does not like admitting design flaws. It prefers disposable parts. Catherine had been discarded legally, stripped of title and dignity with procedural precision. Anne was discarded theatrically, her fall engineered to look like moral necessity. Jane was discarded biologically, dying just after fulfilling her function. 3 different exits, 1 consistent message. Queens were temporary scaffolding, useful until the structure stood, irrelevant afterward. By the time Henry reached for his 4th wife, the pattern was unmistakable to everyone except Henry himself. Each marriage increased anxiety rather than resolving it. Each attempt to control biology only highlighted how uncontrollable it remained. The court watched this repetition with professional detachment. Survival meant adjusting expectations downward. Anne of Cleves arrived as a contract, not a desire, a diplomatic alliance translated into flesh. Henry had not chosen her. He had approved a portrait. The difference mattered. When the reality disappointed him, the system adapted instantly. The marriage was declared unconsummated. The queen was returned politely, compensated generously, and erased publicly. This was progress of a kind. No blood, no scandal, just a transaction reversed. The improvement was superficial. What had changed was not Henry's view of women, but his efficiency in disposing of them. Anne survived because she accepted demotion without resistance. Compliance became a survival strategy. She lived comfortably because she agreed to become invisible. Catherine Howard did not understand this rule. She was youth without armor, raised in a household where boundaries had been suggestions rather than laws. Her value to Henry was her freshness, her ability to make him forget his own decline. When that illusion shattered, her history was reinterpreted as crime. What had once been overlooked became evidence. Desire curdled into punishment. Her execution was less about adultery than about embarrassment. Henry could tolerate betrayal in theory. He could not tolerate being made ridiculous. A king humiliated is a king endangered. Catherine's youth reminded him too sharply of what he had lost. She died not for what she did, but for what she represented. By the time Catherine Parr entered the story, the role of queen had been thoroughly demystified. She was selected not for fertility or beauty, but for competence. A caretaker, a nurse, a mediator. She survived because she learned the final rule of Tudor queenship. Do not become central, do not become interesting, do not become necessary. Even so, survival required constant calibration. Catherine Parr nearly followed the others when her religious views drifted too close to reformist enthusiasm. She was saved not by innocence, but by speed. Submission delivered faster than accusation. Apology before arrest. In this system, timing was mercy. Collectively, these women reveal the deeper architecture of Tudor power. Marriage had ceased to be alliance or affection. It had become a stress test. Each queen exposed a different fault line: legitimacy, desire, vanity, aging, ideology. The crown cracked them open one by one to see where it failed. The damage extended beyond the individuals. Each discarded queen weakened the very institution Henry claimed to protect. Marriage lost credibility. Succession grew chaotic. Foreign courts adjusted expectations downward. England looked powerful but unstable, strong but unpredictable. A kingdom ruled by a man who could not coexist with permanence. Children raised in this environment absorbed the lesson intuitively. Attachment was dangerous. Visibility was risky. Silence was safer. The future rulers of England grew up watching their mothers replaced, erased, or destroyed. Family was not a refuge. It was a liability. This was the inheritance Henry passed down. Queens as collateral damage was not an accident of temperament. It was a systemic outcome. A state designed around one man's insecurity will always consume those closest to him first. Power concentrates stress inward. Those at the center absorb the blast. By the end of Henry's reign, the role of queen had been hollowed out, reduced to symbolism, logistics, and risk management. The crown remained. The women around it became footnotes, cautionary tales whispered in corridors. And yet history was not finished with queens. The system that devoured them was about to be inherited by children who had learned its rules too well. Children who understood that survival required distance, that authority demanded performance, that intimacy was optional and dangerous. The Tudor crown had consumed wives to stabilize itself. What remained was a household trained in suspicion, a state allergic to vulnerability, and a generation prepared to rule without affection. The collateral damage had done its work. Children do not inherit kingdoms. They inherit habits. By the time the Tudor crown passed into smaller hands, the palace was already a classroom in paranoia. Silence was rewarded. Emotion was punished. Survival meant learning when not to speak, when not to be seen, and when to disappear behind ceremony. The ruins were not architectural. They were psychological. Edward was given a crown before he was given a body capable of carrying it. He was raised not as a child, but as a concept, a solution, proof that the sacrifices had been worth it. Every adult around him treated his existence as validation. That attention came with an invisible burden. He was not allowed to fail. He was not allowed to doubt. He was certainly not allowed to hesitate. Where his father had been ruled by appetite, Edward was ruled by conviction. He absorbed doctrine like a weapon. Reform was no longer a political maneuver. It was a moral crusade conducted by a boy with no memory of stability and no patience for ambiguity. His reign was short, but decisive in its damage. Churches stripped, images destroyed, ritual flattened into text. England was reordered by someone too young to remember why people needed beauty in the first place. He did not act cruelly. He acted efficiently. That was the inheritance. Mary learned a different lesson. She inherited humiliation, declared illegitimate, separated from her mother. Forced into obedience under threat of erasure, faith became her only constant. When everything else was negotiable, belief was the one thing that did not move. By the time she reached the throne, compromise felt like betrayal. Mercy felt like weakness. Her burnings were not sadism, they were desperation. She was trying to cauterize a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Elizabeth learned the most important lesson of all: never need anyone. She watched mothers disappear. She watched sisters rise and fall. She watched how quickly affection became evidence. Her childhood taught her that survival depended on distance. She learned to turn herself into an abstraction, something admired but untouched, something symbolic rather than intimate. By the time she wore the crown, she was already older than her years and younger than her image. Together, these children represented three responses to inherited ruin: certainty, retribution, performance. None of them were taught how to rule gently. They were taught how to endure. The Tudor household had not prepared successors. It had prepared survivors. That difference mattered. A ruler trained to endure will prioritize control over continuity. They will mistake fear for loyalty and obedience for peace. Each child approached the throne not as a place to belong, but as a structure that might collapse at any moment. Edward ruled like a theologian with an army. Mary ruled like a martyr with a match. Elizabeth ruled like an actress who understood that the stage itself was fragile. Each approach was shaped less by ideology than by upbringing. What united them was distrust of permanence. None of them believed stability lasted. Every reign felt provisional. Every ally felt temporary. Every solution felt conditional. This produced speed, decisiveness, and catastrophic overcorrection. Edward erased the past. Mary tried to resurrect it. Elizabeth froze it in place and refused to let it age. The ruins they inherited were not cleaned up, they were repurposed. The court, meanwhile, adapted with professional flexibility. Loyalty became ideological when useful and personal when profitable. Advisors learned to speak in layers. Policies were written to survive regime change. Conviction became theater. Survival became strategy. This environment shaped governance itself. England became a country fluent in doublespeak, a nation where public conformity masked private divergence. The Tudors did not invent this skill. They refined it, made it necessary. Religion became less about belief and more about alignment. Politics less about vision and more about positioning. Children raised in fear produce systems that reward caution over creativity. England grew strong, but brittle. The absence of affection at the center of power created distance everywhere else. Subjects learned not to expect warmth. Only order, only spectacle, only results. Elizabeth understood this intuitively. She did not promise comfort. She promised continuity. Her genius was recognizing that after decades of instability, the country would accept illusion over intimacy. She offered symbols instead of heirs, ritual instead of reform, presence instead of change. But this strategy was born from damage, not optimism. She ruled alone, not because she desired isolation, but because isolation had kept her alive. The Tudor children were not healed by power. Power simply gave them room to reenact what they had learned. Edward died, convinced he had purified the nation. Mary died, convinced she had failed God. Elizabeth died, convinced she had outlived usefulness itself. None of them escaped the household that shaped them. They carried it into law, ceremony, and memory. Dynasties often imagine children as continuations. The Tudors produced children as consequences. By the time the crown reached its final bearer, the lesson was complete. Survival required spectacle. Authority required distance. Love was optional and dangerous. The ruins were inherited intact, and the children built their reigns on top of them, mistaking endurance for wisdom and control for peace. She did not inherit power, she rebranded it. By the time Elizabeth took the crown, England was exhausted. Not defeated, not broken, just tired in the specific way that comes from watching rulers panic in different directions. The country had tried certainty, it had tried purification, it had tried fire. What remained was a collective desire for something quieter, something that would simply last. Elizabeth understood this hunger immediately, and she understood the trap hidden inside it. Everyone wanted her to marry, not out of romance, but fear. A woman alone on the throne looked unfinished, temporary, vulnerable. Marriage was supposed to stabilize her rule, anchor it in male authority, turn the crown into a shared responsibility. Elizabeth saw what history had already demonstrated repeatedly. Marriage did not stabilize power. It redistributed it, usually away from the throne. She had grown up watching what happened to women who allowed proximity to authority. They were consumed, replaced, erased, or sanctified only after death. Marriage was not partnership, it was annexation. So she refused, not loudly, not defiantly. She refused slowly, politely, strategically. Each proposal was entertained just long enough to extract value. Each suitor became leverage. Each negotiation became theater. Hope was extended and withdrawn like credit. Elizabeth turned indecision into doctrine. The refusal to marry was framed not as absence, but abundance. She was married already, she said. Married to the realm. Married to England. It was a brilliant abstraction. The country became her spouse. The people became witnesses. The crown became a ring that could never be taken off. This solved multiple problems at once. There would be no foreign king siphoning authority, no domestic noble provoking civil war, no heir creating impatience, no husband demanding obedience. Power remained singular, theatrical, and hers. She replaced bloodline with brand. The Virgin Queen was not chastity. It was insulation. Desire redirected into spectacle. Intimacy transformed into distance. Elizabeth did not deny sexuality. She weaponized it. She allowed flirtation without access, affection without consequence. She became the object of devotion rather than possession. Portraits did the rest. Pearls, white gowns, ageless skin, symbols layered so thick they replaced reality. Elizabeth did not age in public. She accrued iconography instead. As her body weakened, her image hardened. This was governance by illusion, and it worked. Foreign courts waited. Kings lingered. Suitors stalled invasions while hoping for marriages that would never come. Diplomacy slowed into ritual. England bought time with charm. Delay became defense. Domestically, she offered balance instead of zeal. After decades of ideological whiplash, moderation felt like mercy. Elizabeth understood that belief was personal, but order was public. She allowed ambiguity to do what force could not, hold the country together without demanding sincerity. Her rule was not gentle, it was precise. She watched closely, listened selectively, punished decisively. Mercy was extended only when it reinforced control. Threats were neutralized quietly whenever possible and theatrically when necessary. She understood that violence loses impact when used too often. Fear must be rationed. Elizabeth's court became a mirror maze. Favors rotated. Access fluctuated. No one felt secure enough to rebel comfortably. Affection was currency. Attention was power. She cultivated dependence without intimacy. This was not loneliness, it was architecture. Her refusal to marry was the final adaptation of the Tudor system. Where her father consumed wives, she consumed expectation. Where her siblings ruled through belief, she ruled through perception. She accepted that stability was fragile and built a reign designed not to provoke stress fractures. The price was personal. She lived surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone, aging without acknowledgement, pain concealed under makeup, vulnerability hidden beneath ritual. To be eternal, she had to remain distant. To be untouchable, she had to be unreachable. But the country thrived under this arrangement. Trade expanded, culture flourished. England stopped tearing itself apart long enough to imagine itself as something permanent. Elizabeth did not fix the Tudor paradox. She suspended it. She proved that power could survive without succession, authority without intimacy, continuity without heirs. It was a brilliant solution and an unsustainable one, because when the performance ended, there would be nothing behind the curtain except the state itself. And states, unlike people, do not inherit crowns. They simply continue. Elizabeth refused to marry, so England could endure. The dynasty, however, was already finished. Dynasties do not usually die loudly. They decay until no one notices the moment they stop breathing. The Tudors ended not with rebellion or conquest, but with continuity handed to an outsider who inherited the machine without the family. The bloodline vanished. The structure remained. Elizabeth's death was deliberately quiet. No final speech, no declaration of legacy, no named successor spoken aloud. She understood that endings invite scrutiny. Silence preserves illusion. When the crown passed to James of Scotland, it did so smoothly enough to look inevitable. That was the final Tudor achievement. Even extinction had been managed. James arrived as a solution Henry VII would have hated, and history found amusing. The crown passed to the son of the woman Elizabeth had executed. A genealogical joke delivered with cosmic precision. A century of paranoia about rival bloodlines ended with surrender to one of them. The wheel completed its rotation without apology. And yet England did not collapse. That was the benefit. The Tudors had spent generations building a state capable of surviving them. They centralized authority, crushed rival power bases, nationalized belief, professionalized administration, and trained the country to accept spectacle over intimacy. By the time the family disappeared, the crown no longer needed them. It needed only continuity. The monarchy had become an institution rather than a household. This was not an accident. It was the unintended outcome of insecurity scaled into policy. Henry VII ruled as if betrayal were inevitable. Henry VIII ruled as if biology were sabotage. Elizabeth ruled as if exposure were fatal. Each approach hardened the system. Each ruler reinforced the same lesson from a different angle. Trust nothing. Control everything. Perform constantly. The Tudors did not create modern England out of vision. They created it out of fear, but fear is productive. It builds walls. It funds navies. It creates bureaucracy. It rewards obedience. Over time, it produces stability of a very specific kind, durable, cautious, and suspicious of extremes. When the family ended, England was no longer a feudal patchwork. It was a centralized state with a national identity, a professional government, a dominant navy, and a population trained to navigate contradiction. Public conformity, private divergence, a nation fluent in survival. Religion had been broken and reassembled into something uniquely English. Authority had been stripped of sacred mystery and replaced with legal supremacy. The king or queen was no longer God's lieutenant. They were the state's embodiment, replaceable in theory, dangerous in practice. The Tudors left behind a paradox they never resolved. Absolute authority paired with fragile legitimacy. Power concentrated so tightly that it depended entirely on performance to justify itself. This would become the problem of the next century. The Stuarts inherited a crown designed by people who distrusted inheritance itself. They received centralized power without the instincts required to manage it. The Tudor machine required restraint, ambiguity, and theatrical distance. James and his heirs preferred certainty, theology, and direct assertion. They mistook possession for permission. The result was predictable. Within 2 generations, England would execute a king publicly, something no Tudor would have allowed to become imaginable. The system they built made it possible. The instincts they cultivated made it inevitable. That is the final irony. The Tudors spent a century eliminating threats to sovereignty. In doing so, they taught the nation that sovereignty was not sacred. It was structural. If a king could break the church, execute queens, dissolve monasteries, rewrite succession, and rule by image, then kingship itself was negotiable. Once power is demystified, it can be dismantled. The Tudors also left behind a cultural legacy more durable than their blood. Language flourished, theater thrived, history became spectacle. Shakespeare did not merely write under Elizabeth. He was enabled by a society trained to think in metaphor, contradiction, and performance. The Tudors taught England how to narrate itself. They also taught it how to endure leaders it did not like. That lesson mattered. The dynasty that began with a crown pulled from mud ended with a crown passing politely across borders. No roses, no thorns, just procedure. The family obsessed with lineage proved that lineage was optional. What remained was the nation. Modern England was not born from unity or enlightenment. It was forged through administrative paranoia, religious violence, sexual insecurity, and relentless image management. The Tudors are remembered for their drama because they lived inside it. But their real achievement was quieter. They normalized the idea that the state outlives the family. The benefits were real: stability, identity, infrastructure, global ambition. The costs were equally real: trauma, surveillance, cynicism, a permanent suspicion of power that would define English politics long after the Tudors were reduced to portraits and cautionary tales. They tried to defy biology. They failed. They tried to secure blood. They failed. They tried to control legacy. They partially succeeded. The House of Tudor died childless in the most important sense. No ideology survived intact. No belief remained pure. No solution endured permanently. What survived was a system capable of absorbing failure and continuing anyway. That was the final Tudor paradox. They drowned themselves trying to drink power, but in doing so, they filled the reservoir that would supply the future. The dynasty was extinct, the state was immortal,